was just after sunset when the first scream pierced through the quiet evening air. Neighbors rushed out of their homes, confusion painted across their faces. The lights in the small town flickered on, one by one, like witnesses awakening from a long sleep. At the end of Elm Street, inside a modest brick house with white curtains and a porch swing that never squeaked, something unimaginable had just happened. Detective Rami stepped out of his unmarked car, coffee still warm in his hand, expecting nothing more than a domestic argument. He had been here before. These people were calm, religious, respectful. No crime, no scandals, just community dinners and Sunday sermons. But as he stepped through the open door, the smell of iron froze his breath. There, lying face down on the kitchen floor, was Mrs. Hale, the woman everyone adored, the woman who brought soup when her child was sick, who sang in the church choir, who smiled even when her own hands trembled with age. Blood soaked into the tile like ink on paper, silent, deep, irreversible. There were no signs of forced entry, no stolen items, no footprints in the flower beds outside, just silence, except for the low ticking of the kitchen clock, counting down the seconds of a piece that had just shattered. By morning, the town was in mourning. Candles were lit, prayers were whispered, and speculation bloomed like weeds. Who would do this? Who could even think of harming her? And yet, in the middle of it all stood a young man in his early 30s. Head bowed, hands folded. His name was Elias. Everyone knew him, kind, soft-spoken, always helping others. He had cared for Mrs. Hale like a mother. The sight of him crying by her porch was enough to convince anyone he was heartbroken. But behind those tears was something else, something no one noticed, a flicker, a twitch, a shadow, because the truth was, Elias had secrets even silence couldn't hide. This is not just a story of murder. It's a story of masks, of how evil doesn't always shout, but whispers. And sometimes, the ones we trust the most are the ones we should have feared all along. Elderwood was the kind of town that felt like a postcard. Kids rode bicycles without fear. Doors were left unlocked, and every stranger was a future neighbor. The streets, lined with sycamore trees, held decades of laughter and memories. From the outside, it was paradise. But paradise, as it turns out, can rot from the inside. After Mrs. Hale's body was discovered, the entire town seemed to shift. The air grew heavier. Smiles became shorter. People began looking over their shoulders. Something unspoken crept into every conversation, a whisper that the town they knew so well was no longer safe. Detective Rami set up a temporary investigation center in the old fire station. Files began to pile up, interviews were conducted, and yet nothing made sense. There was no sign of forced entry, no history of enemies, no known threats. And yet the crime was intimate, brutal but focused, emotional but silent. He started with the neighbors. Each of them spoke of Mrs. Hale with the same reverence, the same disbelief. She didn't deserve this, one said. She was like a mother to us all. But when Rami asked if she had any recent visitors, they hesitated. Eyes darted. Word became careful. One name came up more than once. Elias. He had been seen entering her house just a day before the murder. He often ran errands for her, brought her groceries, helped with small repairs. Everyone trusted him. No one wanted to suspect him. But Rami knew better than to ignore patterns. And it wasn't just Mrs. Hale. The detective began combing through unsolved reports from the past 5 years. Odd disappearances. Quiet rumors. A teenager who went missing. A retired teacher who was found dead, but ruled a heart attack. At the time, none of these events seemed connected. But now, the gaps between them felt too narrow to ignore. There were secrets in Elderwood, long-buried ones. The kind that wear a friendly face and pass unnoticed in daylight. The kind that make you wonder how much you really know about the person living next door. And as Rami dug deeper, the town's perfect surface began to crack. Behind every closed curtain was a truth no one dared to speak. And at the center of it all, like the eye of a storm, stood a man no one wanted to question. The medical examiner confirmed it wasn't an accident. Mrs. Hale had been struck twice in the back of the head with a blunt object. There were bruises on her wrists, defensive marks, signs she had tried to fight. The blow that ended her life was delivered with force, not fury. Calm, controlled, calculated. The town that once celebrated community now gathered in fear. Elderwood had seen its share of tragedies. Fires, storms, the occasional car crash, but never this. Never blood spilled by one of their own. The murder sent a chill through the heart of every family. Parents walked their children to school again. Shopkeepers installed security cameras. Trust began to wither. Detective Rami returned to the scene, walking through the house with measured steps. He noticed something odd. No fingerprints, no signs of struggle except around the body. Whoever did this knew the layout, knew her habits. This wasn't random. It was personal. The object used was never found. The killer had cleaned up well, but not perfectly. Under the dining table, tucked beneath the edge of the rug, he found a single button. Small, black, old, unfamiliar. He sent it to forensics and continued his search for motive. Mrs. Hale had no enemies. She lived alone. No known family disputes. But she did have a safety deposit box, one Detective Rami requested access to. Inside, there were documents, property deeds, handwritten letters, and something else, a photograph, slightly torn at the edges. It showed a young boy, maybe 6 or 7, standing in front of a white fence. On the back, it read, Elias, 1998. The letters told a different story. In one, she wrote about a boy she once tried to help. A troubled child from a broken home. How she feared she had failed him. He comes to see me sometimes, she wrote. Still quiet, still distant. But there's something in his eyes I can't explain. That line stayed with Rami. Something in his eyes. When Elias was brought in for questioning, he was calm, cooperative, expressed deep sorrow. He even offered to help with funeral arrangements. But when asked about the photograph, his posture shifted. A slight pause, a half-second longer than normal. Not enough for most to notice, but enough for Rami. As the town buried Mrs. Hale, the cracks widened. Whispers turned to questions. Doubt took root. A brutal murder had done more than take a life. It had shattered the illusion of peace. And the quiet man who once blended into every background was suddenly the only one anyone noticed. VV, they called him gentle. The kind of man who held doors open for strangers, picked up groceries for the elderly, and never raised his voice, even when wronged. Elias had grown up in Elderwood. Or at least, he'd grown older there. No one really knew where he came from before. He appeared one day as a teenager, taken in by a foster family who described him as quiet, obedient, respectful. He stayed out of trouble, kept to himself, and blended into the fabric of the town like he'd always belonged. He was the one people turned to in small moments of need. A flat tire, a broken gate, a ride to the doctor. His phone never went unanswered. His smile, soft and unwavering, became his signature. People said he had a calming presence. But behind every smile is a thought unspoken. Rami started pulling school records. Nothing remarkable. Average grades. No behavioral issues. But his file was thin, unusually so. Few photographs. Fewer personal notes. When he visited Elias's old foster home, the couple had moved away. Neighbors recalled they left suddenly after their teenage daughter had run away. No one heard from her again. At the local library, Rami found something strange. A stack of old newspaper clippings from the early 2000s. One had a small article about a fire in a nearby town. A family of 3 found dead. House burned to ash. No suspects. The name of the boy mentioned in the article was blurred by water damage. But the photo accompanying it, the eyes were familiar. He brought Elias in again. This time, the questions were pointed. Where were you before Elderwood? Why are there no photos of your childhood? Elias sat still, his hands folded tightly in his lap. He answered politely, but without detail. I move around a lot, he said. Foster homes. Nothing permanent. But the mask was beginning to strain. A church volunteer later told Rami about something she had noticed months before. A moment when Elias was playing with children during a community event. A boy accidentally spilled juice on his shirt. Elias froze, not visibly angry, but tense. His smile vanished for just a second. His grip on the boy's wrist had been too tight. She thought nothing of it at the time. Now she wondered. The town still wanted to believe in his goodness. They clung to the version of Elias they had built in their minds. But Rami was no longer sure. What if the kindness was a performance? What if the gentle soul they saw was carefully rehearsed? Some monsters don't hide in shadows. Some walk in daylight, offer to help, and look you in the eye while doing it. It started with subtle unease. People who once praised Elias now hesitated before mentioning his name. Friends began replaying conversations in their heads, remembering things they had dismissed, like the time he knew about an argument between a couple that no one else had been told, or how he always seemed to show up when things went wrong. Never before, never after, but always in the middle. Detective Rami followed the threads, and they began to twist. One of Elias's co-workers at the auto repair shop revealed that Elias had taken sudden interest in security systems, cameras, alarm codes. Another mentioned that he once caught Elias standing silently in the break room, staring at the wall, unaware that someone had entered. When asked if he was okay, Elias smiled and said, "Just thinking." One of the most disturbing revelations came from an elderly man Elias had cared for during his illness. The man's daughter mentioned that her father had become paranoid in the final months before his death. He believed someone was watching him at night, entering his home while he slept. Everyone thought it was dementia until his heart failed, and Elias was the one who found him. The case was closed without suspicion, but now it felt like part of a pattern. Rami requested phone records. They showed dozens of late-night calls to unknown numbers, all from public payphones. It was an old tactic, untraceable, quiet, the kind of thing most people don't even think to look for anymore. But Elias had, which meant he was careful. A woman from the local library finally came forward. She admitted she had once gone on a single date with Elias, months ago. She said he was charming at first, attentive, but by the second meeting, something changed. He asked strange questions about her family, her habits, whether she lived alone. She stopped replying. A week later, someone had entered her home while she was out. Nothing was stolen, but her books were moved. Her bedroom closet left slightly ajar. She never filed a report. She felt embarrassed, unsafe. But now, as the town's trust began to crumble, she wasn't the only one wondering how many others had ignored the same feeling. Elias's world, once built on perfect impressions, began to collapse under its own weight. Each new clue didn't just raise suspicion. It made people question their own memories. Had he always been that quiet? Had they always felt uneasy around him but brushed it off as shyness? The web he spun wasn't made of lies told directly. It was crafted from silence, from gaps in stories, from details that didn't quite fit but never drew attention. Until now, the deeper Rami dug, the more the present began to echo with the past. Files long untouched were reopened. Among them was a thin, overlooked folder marked with a single name, Sarah Delmont, a teenager who vanished 15 years ago. No suspects, no remains, just an open wound in the community that had quietly scarred over. Sarah lived only 2 houses down from where Elias's first foster family once stayed. At the time, Elias was barely 16, a quiet, withdrawn boy new to Elderwood. No one had linked him to Sarah's disappearance. There was no reason to. But the case file held one detail that struck Rami hard. Sarah had reported feeling followed in the weeks before she vanished. Her final entry in a tattered journal read, "He's always watching. I don't know why." The handwriting trembled. Fear seeped from the words. Rami sought out Sarah's former neighbor, Mrs. Caldwell. Now in her 80s, she lived in a nursing home on the outskirts of town. Her mind was sharp, her memories intact. When shown a photo of Elias as a teen, her face paled. "That's the boy," she whispered. "He used to sit outside their house. Just sit there, for hours. Didn't speak, just stared." She remembered one particular night. Sirens had passed, dogs barking, lights flashing down the street. The next morning, Sarah was gone. She'd assumed it was unrelated, but now she wasn't so sure. Rami returned to the site of Sarah's old home, now abandoned. Cracks spread to the walls, ivy crawling over broken windows. In the backyard, a rusted swing creaked in the breeze. He walked the perimeter, scanning, searching, until his foot struck something solid under the soil, a piece of wood. Beneath it, buried just a foot deep, he found a small tin box. Inside, a necklace with a bird pendant, wrapped in a plastic bag. It matched the one Sarah was last seen wearing. He sent it for testing. Soil samples, DNA, anything to connect the present to the past. That night, alone in his office, Rami replayed every case Elias had ever been near. A pattern emerged, subtle, chilling, vulnerable victims. No signs of break-in. Each incident dismissed as accident, misfortune, or tragedy. But buried in the silence were clues. Signs the town had ignored. Sarah's case was not an isolated tragedy. It was a beginning, a blueprint, the first page of a dark journal written in fear and finished in blood. And the person who held the pen had never left. It started with a whisper in the church hallway, a brief, hushed exchange between two women who quickly turned away when Rami approached. Then another came forward, an anonymous letter slid beneath the police station door. No name, no return address, just trembling words written in black ink. I saw him the night she died. I was afraid to speak. I still am. Rami felt the shift. Fear was turning into confession. Silence into scattered voices. He began revisiting witnesses, this time with sharper questions, heavier silences. It was the grocer who finally broke. He remembered seeing Elias walk past his shop late that night, around 11:30 p.m., only minutes before the estimated time of Mrs. Hale's death. Elias was alone, without his usual calm, walking fast, head down, and wearing gloves, on a warm night. The grocer thought it strange, but didn't think it mattered at the time. He just always seemed safe. Then came the teenager, Jake, a quiet boy from a neighborhood. He confessed to seeing Elias near the back gate of Mrs. Hale's house 2 nights before the murder, not entering, just standing, watching. When asked why he hadn't said anything, Jake stared at the floor. Because he smiled at me when he saw me, and I thought maybe I was wrong. The more Rami listened, the more he realized how many people had seen pieces of the puzzle, but never put them together. Elias's presence was so familiar, so harmless on the surface, that no one thought to question it. He had become invisible in his kindness. A local handyman shared that he once found Elias in a restricted area behind the church, near where sensitive documents were stored. When questioned, Elias simply said he was looking for a quiet place to pray. No one thought twice. Another neighbor admitted that she'd seen Elias throw something into the river the day after the murder. A black bag, heavy, sinking fast. She told herself it was just trash. She didn't want to believe it could be more. The weight of collective silence began to break. The truths people had buried out of comfort or fear were rising to the surface, one by one. And what emerged was a chilling portrait of a man who had always been there, always smiling, always helpful, and always watching. Elias hadn't escaped suspicion because he was clever. He escaped because he had convinced an entire town that there was no reason to look. The search warrant was signed just after midnight. By sunrise, Detective Rami stood outside Elias's modest home on Willow Lane, a small, well-kept cottage with trimmed hedges and clean windows. The kind of place you'd expect to smell like fresh coffee and old books. But as officers stepped inside, they quickly realized appearances were, once again, deceiving. The front room was neat, sterile even. Everything in its place. But there was something off. Too much order, like it had been rehearsed. Rami moved toward the hallway, past family photos that didn't belong to Elias. Stock images and frames. Staged warmth. There were no real memories here. No history. In the bedroom, the first real clue appeared. Beneath the bed, they found a hidden compartment. Inside, a collection of small labeled envelopes, each with a name. Mrs. Hale, Sarah Delmont, the old teacher, the missing teenager. There were over a dozen. Each envelope contained something personal. Hair strands, earrings, torn photographs, a page from a journal, trophies. Further inside the house, they found a locked door leading to the basement. The air shifted as they descended, cooler, heavier. The walls were lined with shelves. On them, rows of notebooks, each meticulously dated and coded. Rami opened the first one. Page after page of observations, detailed logs of people in the town, their routines, weaknesses, fears. He wasn't just watching them. He was studying them. On a desk in the far corner sat a large corkboard, photographs, maps, patterns, Mrs. Hale's house, the route Sarah used to walk to school, the grocery store, the library, the nursing home, red string-connected events that, until now, had seemed unrelated. But in this room, they formed a web of purpose. And then, something more chilling, audio tapes, dozens of them, each labeled with dates and names. Recordings of private conversations, phone calls, children playing, couples arguing, none of it legal, all of it deliberate. In one drawer, they found something Rami had dreaded, a small black bag containing tools, duct tape, gloves, rope, and a rusted hammer. The weapon that killed Mrs. Hale was no longer a mystery. But what haunted Rami most wasn't the evidence. It was a journal found in a locked metal box. Elias had written about the first time he felt invisible, how no one ever truly saw him, how being ignored became a kind of power. They only look when it's too late, he wrote. And by then, they're already mine. Behind the smile, behind the politeness, behind the locked doors was a mind that had watched the world with quiet hunger, a man who had learned to mimic humanity so well, even he almost believed it, until the mask slipped and the door finally opened. It started with a whisper, discovery spread through Elderwood like wildfire. Hushed exchange between two women, people who once welcomed Elias into their homes, now avoided and another came forward with one another, an anonymous letter that they had ever trusted him. Door. Mothers pulled their children closer. No return address. Neighbors bolted their doors in broad black ink. And in the center of the night she died. A man who I was afraid in handcuffs. I still am. Elias said nothing during his arrest. Fear was turning into confession. No panic. Silence. Just a scattered, almost deliberate nod. He began revisiting, as if acknowledging something long overdue. This time with sharper questions. The officers noticed how he looked directly into Rami's eyes. It was the grocer who finally broke. Unblinking. He remembered seeing Elias walk past his shop late that night. The interrogation room was cold. Only minutes before the estimated Rami time placed a box of evidence on the table. Elias was alone, photographs without his usual calm, weapon, walking for fast, head down, and Elias remained silent. On a warm night, then finally, the grocer voice so calm it chilled the bones, but didn't think it mattered at the time. I was never hiding. Always he said, "Say, I just waited for someone to notice." Jake, he didn't deny the murders. Boy from a neighborhood. He explained he confessed to seeing Elias near the back gate of Mrs. Hale's house 2 nights before the murder. The teacher had asked too many questions. Just standing. Mrs. Hale had gotten too close. Why he hadn't said anything, Jake stared to him. Wasn't because he smiled at me when he saw me. Control. And I thought a way to correct what he believed the world. The more Rami listened, the more he realized how many people had seen pieces of puzzle, how he chose never put them not at random. Elias' presence was so familiar, vulnerable, so harmless on the surface, alone, that no one killed out of rage. He had become killed to remind himself that he existed. A local handyman shared that he once found Elias ignored in a restricted area. This is how he made them look. Near where sensitive documents were stored. Headlines called him the gentle butcher. Elias simply said he was looking for a quiet man behind the smile. No one thought twice. Interviews flooded the town. Another neighbor admitted victims' families were pulled Elias into chaos. Throws something into the room the day after others murder. Refused to speak. A black bag. One woman, heavy, trembling with disbelief, whispered. She told herself it was he held just my baby once. She didn't want to believe it could be more. The Rami watched it all unfold, began to knowing this would never leave the truths people had Elias had poisoned something far deeper than safety. Were rising to the surface. He had corrupted one by one. And what emerged was a chilling portrait. Every past man who had now always been suspicion like a stain. Always smiling. The town held a candlelight vigil always watching. Elias hadn't escaped suspicion. 13 lights. Because he was clever. But many felt the real number might be higher. Because he had convinced an entire town. Forgotten. Lives were raised so perfectly that no one even knew they were missing. Just as Elias sat in his cell, by sunrise, untouched by the storm, Detective Rami stood outside Elias' modest home on Willow Lane. A small, well-kept cottage didn't feel like victory and clean windows. It felt like grief. The kind of place when the mask finally falls, fresh coffee. You don't just see the killer. You
But
see,
as officers
every
stepped
moment
inside,
he looked away.
they quickly
The
realized
discovery
appearances
came from a
were
dusty
once
attic
again
box
deceiving.
retrieved during the
front
final
room was
clearance
neat,
of Mrs. Hale's
sterile
home,
even,
tucked between
everything
old
in its
photographs and
place.
yellowing recipe
But there was
cards
something
was
off.
a leather-bound diary.
Too much order.
Its pages
like it had
worn,
been rehearsed.
its spine cracked.
Rami moved toward
It was
the
something
hallway.
no one had known
Past
existed.
family photos that
Not
didn't
even
belong
those
to
closest
Elias.
to her.
Stock
Quiet
images and
confession,
frames, written not
stage
for the world,
warmth,
but for
there were
herself.
no real memories
Detective
here.
Rami opened
No
it,
history.
unsure
In the
what he'd
bedroom.
find. The first
What he
real
read
clue
changed
appeared.
everything.
Beneath the bed,
entries began
they found a
gently.
hidden compartment.
Reflections on life.
Inside,
Gratitude
a collection
for
of
small
small
blessings.
labeled envelopes
And musings about
each
the people
with a
in her
name.
community.
Mrs.
But as
Hale,
the pages turned,
Sarah
a
Delmont,
shift began to
the
surface.
old teacher,
Mrs. Hale
the missing
wrote about
teenager.
Elias.
There were
At
over a
first, with
dozen.
affection.
Each envelope
She described him as a
contained
lost
something
boy,
hair
a
strands,
quiet soul trying to
earrings
find a place
torn
in the
photographs.
She had
page
offered
from
him
a journal,
warmth,
guidance,
trophies,
and trust.
Further
But
inside
over
the
time,
house,
her
they
words
found a
grew
locked
heavier.
door leading to the
He
basement.
watches more than he
The
speaks.
air shifted as
she
they
wrote.
descended.
He listens
Cooler,
to things not meant
heavier.
for him. The walls
She began
were
to
lined
notice
with
strange
shelves.
things.
On them,
Objects
rows
slightly
of
moved.
notebooks, drawers
Each
she hadn't
meticulously
opened,
dated and
a
coded.
lingering presence.
Rami
of her
opened the first
when no
one.
one was supposed
Page
to be there.
after page of
But
observations.
every time she confronted
Detailed
the feeling,
logs of people in the
Elias
town.
would appear,
Their routines.
smiling, helpful,
Weaknesses.
present.
Fears.
She doubted herself.
He wasn't just watching
She
them.
feared she
He
was
was studying
imagining
them.
things.
On a desk in
But
the
her
far
gut
corner
never
sat a
settled.
large corkboard.
In one entry,
Photographs.
she described
Maps.
waking up in the middle of the
Patterns.
night and finding
Mrs. Hale's
Elias
house.
sitting
The route
silently
Sarah used to
in
walk
her
to
living
school.
room.
The
He
grocery
claimed he had
store,
heard in the
noise,
library
and wanted to make
the
sure
nursing
she was
home.
safe.
Red
She
string
thanked him,
connected
but
events
inside,
that,
she wrote,
until now,
I have never felt
had
more
seemed
afraid in my
unrelated.
life.
But in this
She
room,
never told the
they
police.
formed a web of purpose.
She didn't want to ruin his life.
And then
She believed,
something more
hoped,
chilling, prayed that what she
audio
saw in his
tapes,
eyes was
dozens
sadness.
of them,
each
not
labeled
something
with
darker.
dates and names.
But the diary told a different
recordings
truth.
of private
Mrs. Hale had
conversations.
known.
Phone calls,
Not everything.
children
but enough.
playing,
She
couples
sensed a
arguing,
danger growing.
none of it legal,
Creeping closer and
all
still
of it deliberate.
She tried
one
to save
drawer.
him.
They
I
found
think he's
something
broken,
Rami had dreaded.
she wrote.
A small
But
black bag
maybe he
containing
doesn't want to be
tools,
fixed.
duct tape,
Her
gloves,
final entry
rope,
was
and
a
a
letter
letter
not to
hammer.
Elias.
The weapon that
But to
killed
whoever
Mrs.
might
Hale
find her words
was no longer a
If
mystery.
anything happens to
But
me,
what haunted
she
Rami
wrote,
most wasn't the evidence.
please understand,
It was a journal
I
found in
tried.
a locked metal
I
box.
saw the cracks.
Elias
I just
had
couldn't
written
bring
about
myself
the first
to
time he
believe
felt
what they
invisible.
meant.
How
Rami
no one ever
closed
truly
the diary
saw him.
with trembling
How
hands.
being ignored became
Mrs.
a kind
Hale
of
had
power.
been more than a
They
victim.
only look when it's too
She had
late,
been a witness,
he wrote.
A
And
mother
by
figure
then,
who
there
saw
already
the
shadow in someone
behind
everyone
the
else
smile,
praised. Behind
and
the
though she
politeness,
couldn't stop him,
behind the
she
locked
left behind
doors
a
was a
truth
mind that
no
watched
one
the
else
world
dared
with
to
quiet
speak.
hunger.
Her
A
words,
man who had learned
written
to
in
mimic
quiet
humanity
desperation,
so well, became the
even he
voice
almost
that
believed
finally
it,
broke the silence.
until the mask slipped
The morning of the
and the
arrest
door
was
finally
unusually
opened.
quiet, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Elias had just finished his morning routine, watered his plants, fed the stray cat that visited his porch, and stepped out in his neatly pressed shirt. When unmarked cars pulled into his driveway, he didn't run. He didn't resist. When officers approached with drawn weapons, he simply raised his hands, as if expecting them. The handcuffs clicked around his wrists with a finality that rippled through the heart of Elderwood. People emerged from their homes, drawn by the flashing lights. They watched in stunned silence as Elias, who once delivered groceries, fixed broken fences, and said kind words to every passing neighbor, was led to the police car. His head was high, his expression unreadable. Not fear, not guilt, just a quiet certainty. The arrest made headlines before noon. Reporters arrived within hours. Cameras swarmed the quiet street, capturing images of shocked residents, many of whom refused to speak. Those who did could barely form words. He read scripture at my father's funeral. One woman whispered, "He helped me when my husband died." Another said, her voice breaking, "I let him babysit my son once." Someone else muttered, staring at the ground. In the police station, Elias sat in an interrogation room under bright lights. His fingerprints matched prints found on the bag recovered from the river. DNA evidence from Mrs. Hale's house confirmed contact. The notebooks, the trophies, the audio tapes, they left no room for doubt. Still, Elias remained calm. He answered questions methodically. No emotion, no denial. To the lead investigator, he finally said, "You all thought I was harmless." That was the only lie I ever needed. For Rami, the hardest part wasn't confirming the crimes. It was understanding how they had been missed for so long. How trust had blinded an entire town. How silence had allowed a predator to walk freely among them. That night, the streets of Elderwood felt different, colder. The porch lights stayed on longer. Children were kept inside. The same people who once celebrated community now questioned every familiar face. Elias's arrest wasn't just a fall of one man. It was a collapse of comfort, of certainty, of everything they believed about their town. And nothing, from that day forward, would ever feel safe again. The letter arrived on a Thursday. Plain envelope. No return address. Stamped and sealed from the county detention center. It was addressed to Detective Rami. He opened it slowly, unsure what to expect. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, written in Elias's precise, tidy handwriting. There were no greetings, no apologies, just thoughts, raw and deliberate. They only saw what they wanted to see. Elias began. That's the first lesson I learned, how easy it is to disappear when no one is really looking. He wrote about his childhood, though not in detail. He hinted at foster homes where affection was traded for silence, places where no one asked questions and no one offered answers. You learn to adapt, he wrote. You learn to study people, find their patterns, see their flaws. It's survival at first. Later, it becomes something else. He spoke of Mrs. Hale, not as a target, but as a mistake. She noticed too much. She asked questions in her way. Not directly, but she saw it. That's why I had to decide. Then he shifted. The tone grew darker. You call me a monster, but monsters are made, not born. I was made in empty rooms, in cold nights when promises never came. I learned that trust is a weapon. When people believe you, they never look behind you. Elias described the act of watching, not with hatred, but fascination. How people moved when they thought no one saw. How fear revealed the truth of who they were. I never killed out of rage. I killed to feel something real, something that proved I wasn't invisible. Toward the end, the writing turned reflective, almost resigned. If I could go back, I don't know what I'd change. Not because I feel no guilt, but because I wouldn't know what to do with forgiveness. The last lines are the most chilling. You think you've stopped something. You haven't. You've only uncovered it. I am not the first. I won't be the last. Look closer. Always look closer. There was no signature. No date. Detective Rami folded the letter slowly, his hands colder than before. It wasn't a confession. It was a final performance, controlled, intentional, and laced with quiet venom. A reminder that even behind bars, Elias still had the last word. And outside those bars, the world would never again feel fully awake. There's a lesson buried in every crime, every tragedy, every silence that goes unnoticed. In Elderwood, it wasn't just one man who failed. It was a collective blindness, a town that chose comfort over questions, familiarity over caution. Elias walked among them, not because he was invisible, but because he knew exactly how to be seen. Polite, helpful, quiet, but beneath that silence was calculation. And in that stillness, lives were lost. We often believe that danger comes loudly, through screams, through anger, through chaos. But sometimes it arrives with a smile, a gentle tone, a steady hand. That's what makes it so dangerous. That's what makes it so easy to ignore. The truth is, trust should be earned, not assumed. And silence, especially when something feels wrong, should never be the easy way out. If something feels off, speak. If someone goes missing, ask. If a pattern doesn't make sense, investigate. Waiting until it's too late is how darkness survives. Elderwood will never be the same. It carries scars now, some visible, some buried deep. But those scars must serve a purpose. A reminder, a warning. Thank you for watching this story unfold, for staying with us through every truth uncovered, every mask removed, every question finally asked. If this story moved you, if it made you think, don't let it end here. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us what you felt, what you noticed, what you'll never forget. And above all, stay aware. This is Crime Chronicles Confidential. Thank you for watching.